Today I'm going to be taking my first look at the brand Valimor. They're a brand that reached out, asked if I wanted to review their watch. I said yes. They sent me one for free, so I don't have to send this back. Keep that in mind. They didn't have to review the video. They didn't tell me what needed to be put in the video, just my honest thoughts. So let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of about 40 millimeters, lug to lug of 46.9, height of 15 millimeters, and a lug width of 22. Some other general specifications for this watch, we're going to have the Miota 8315 beating away in here. It's not a movement I've come across before, but it is cool because it does have a 60-hour power reserve, so that's a nice little touch. And of course we have this very highly customized rotor, which looks pretty cool. We do have a domed sapphire crystal with 3 layers of AR coating. They don't state whether it's on the outside or the inside, or at least I couldn't find it, so it's somewhere. We also have 100 meters of stated water resistance, but this is just a regular push-pull crown. It doesn't screw in. And we use BGW9 for all the hands and the indices on the dial. And last but not least, the watch retails for 500 euros directly from Valimor, or about 410 on the rubber strap instead of the bracelet. So starting off with the dial here, and this is what really drew me to the watch. It's a very unique dial. They definitely did a lot of customization, a lot of unique aspects to it, and it's something that, again, made me want to look at this watch. We have this quote-unquote dragon scale texture to the dial, which is actually very well done. It has this fume type effect where it's the bluest in the middle and it kind of fades to black at the edges, and it does look really premium. It's a nice texture. We also have these very defined numerals. It's interspaced between numerals and these kind of little, I guess, coffin-shaped markers, which look pretty cool. But they are very thick. They're very stylized, of course, in this kind of like Old English type styling that it's going for with this entire watch being inspired by the legend of King Arthur. So, of course, you have these knight themes, these dragon themes, and it all works really well and really interestingly. You have this sword style handset that looks pretty cool, really unique, especially this very defined hour hand sword. And I believe this hour hand sword is supposed to be inspired by the sword in the stone legend of King Arthur. I really like that they kept the text very minimal. We just have Valimor and the logo here at 12 o'clock and automatic here at the 6. Nothing else that you need. It doesn't say where it's made, doesn't say water resistance, doesn't say inspired by King Arthur, doesn't say knight on it or something, you know? It is clean, it's classic, and it's simple. What I also really like, and you'll be able to see it more once we zoom in, but we have this raised chapter track, which of course holds like the minute markers, the 5, 10, 15, 20 written out there. But between those areas, you have this very decorative pattern, very much of a like ornamental knight's armor, or potentially like a banner of some kind of house or somewhat. It has this very unique flowy design to it that I think looks very premium. It's really awesome too, is as you move it around, as you just look at the watch, it has this color depth change to it. It goes from a darker blue to this lighter, more metallic sheen, and it is a really well executed part of the watch, which I was not expecting, and looks really amazing on the dial. I think the dial is done in a very crisp, clean, and legible way. It is at harmony with its own design language, and there's a lot of detail which I think we need to zoom in a little bit more just to appreciate. Taking a look at the watch in natural light, in direct sunlight the dial really pops off nicely. At off angles it goes a little bit more flat blue, direct on a brighter blue. The black kind of really pops out at the off angles. But again, the legibility is good, every element looks good under harsh sunlight, and usually watches don't stand up to sunlight this well, so they did a good job. When you move to the shade though, it becomes a little bit too glare intensive. It becomes a little bit too reflective. At some off angles or at some dead on angles, it can be pretty visible, but it is very glare prone. Again, in sunlight kind of slash shaded, you don't see it as much. And at this angle, you can kind of see how I can say you can get past that glare, but it really is all about direct sunlight. It looks the best there. And yeah, it just is a nice looking dial, well put together watch in direct light and in harsher lighting situations. And here the shade is a little bit less intensive, so you can kind of see the detail, but just not as great. So zooming in here on the dial, this is what I meant when I said there was a lot of fun detail that pops up once you look a little bit closer. Of course, we can see this dragon scale pattern, very much of a scaled type pattern that you would see very reptilian in nature. It's not the deepest cut, it's not the most defined, you know, guilloche cut or something like that, but it is a, I think, well done texture. It gets across what it's meant to be inspired by, and the color saturation, color depth of it is really nicely done. Also nice to see it's very uniform. There aren't any imperfections that I can see anywhere in this pattern, so good on them for that. And even down to the way the text is done, the text is kind of raised up a little bit to make it a little bit more, I guess you could just say legible. Usually when you integrate a text into a pattern on the dial, sometimes it can get lost or look a little bit odd. So the way the text is done here looks really nice. It has a three-dimensional quality, and of course is in the same kind of stylized text as the numerals, so it all fits together. Looking at the numerals themselves, of course, in this very stylized text, they look beautiful. They are filled with lume in a very nice way, and of course it glows in this very crisp white tone, so it contrasts really nicely against the dial. It is all just done of a quality that I think is kind of higher than you would expect from a micro brand, which is nice to see. There isn't any blotches of lume missing. It all looks pretty premiumly done. Again, these are more customized shapes, so you got to give them points for that. And looking at some of these smaller details, of course, we have the base dial texture, which is done in this dragon scale pattern. Then we have a little bit of a step up here to another layer with this little bit of a different shade of blue in this minutes track, and each 5-minute mark has this tiny little gold button, which I think is a really nice touch. It looks premium. It really just blends in with the color tones very well. I think had they consistently done this blue and white theme and not introduced some of this gold to it, it could have looked a little plain, a little bit boring, and the gold to me just does feel like it fits with this whole Arthurian legend, this excess. That kind of gets brought to mind when you think of this kind of era of history. Looking at this next step up, again, a different shade of blue, a different finishing, and of course, since we have every 5-minute mark written out in the numeral, you have this very playful pattern in between each part. But as I angle it, it goes this more metallic blue purple, and it just has a little bit more light play. It's another aspect of the wasp where they decided to have fun. They decided to add a little bit of pizzazz, and it is executed really well. The texture has depth to it. It's very defined against that kind of brushed black background, and it all really looks well done. Looking at this customized handset here, again, pretty unique sword style, sword inspired. And then we have the brush side on one and then the polished side on the other, and of course lume filled at the end there. You see there is a little bit of an imperfection on the hour hand as you kind of move it towards that kind of base area there. Looking at the minutes hand, it's kind of similar. You have that kind of little speck of dust on the polished part, whereas the brush part looks pretty clean. It is one of those things where although it's not perfectly QC, it's not egregious either. It does present very well. They're relatively sharp. They have a good shape to them. The lumen fill is done really perfectly, even so that it matches not only color tone wise with the numeral lume, which is rare to see, but matches in terms of like flatness of application. It's not splotchy, it's not too puffy, it doesn't look like freshly fallen snow. It looks very uniform and pretty flat. And of course we have this more stylized hand in gold for the seconds hand. Of course small scratches throughout, but it's kind of hard to see. Even lume filled at the end of the tip there too. I would say the QC issues are very expected at this price point, and they do a good job on every other aspect, so I think they very much can be forgiven for what small little aspects I see here done not perfectly on the dial. So moving into the case of this watch, and I would say this is probably the least interesting part. One, it is a fairly thick case. Again, we're around 15 millimeters or so kind of a chunker, all things considered. It does wear fairly well, but again, just a little on the thick side. But we do have some cool aspects, like the bezel here is inspired by like a dragon fin, so you have this knurling that's a little bit more stylized. It does have a good grip to it, so you can turn the bezel pretty well. Doesn't have a lot of back play, but it does have a little bit of movement in between the settings of the bezel. I will say it has a pretty nice sound to it. It feels consistent, it feels fairly high quality, and you know that you're turning it correctly in a sense. And we also have, of course, a ceramic insert for the bezel here. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have mainly brushed finishing here. We have vertical brushing here on the top of the lugs, a little bit of a polished chamfer here along the side, horizontal brushing here on the case side with a pretty nice curvature to the mid case. It is, again, a fairly thicker mid case, but it does try to hide that thickness. We have, again, vertical brushing here on the links of the bracelet, and then this kind of interesting scaled mid-link that, of course, is more stylized, inspired, again, just by the armor of knights and whatnot. And it's cool. It's nice that they went for something more unique, something different. It's not like everything else that's out there, and that's cool. Then we go to the clasp. We just have a classic butterfly deployant. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of deployants, especially since the way that Valimor does it is they have the same size link for every link, so you either have a really good fit or you don't. Thankfully, this fits me fairly well, so I mean, no complaints there, but for some, they may not be able to get that perfect fit. What is nice is on the back of the bracelet, we do have those quick release spring bars to kind of change into other straps, which is a nice touch. And then a really cool aspect of this watch, in my opinion, is the crown. You have it inspired by a sword hilt. Usually they have a little bit of a stylization to it, and then sometimes you have jewels in the hilt if you're of a very high standing or of nobility or somewhat. And it is executed well. It has a good shape to it. It actually has a very good grip to where you can wind it very easily. Again, it's not a screw down, so there isn't any action or feeling there. But the actual actuation and shape of the crown I think is really nice, and that kind of bluish, blackish gem does tie in with the rest of the dial pretty well. So it's a good executed point of design there. I will say that this movement is a date movement. It doesn't have a ghost date position that you don't see on the front of the dial, so you do feel that click. You do have that crown position when you push out the crown. So that's something that I would like to see improved, especially at this price point, or maybe just go with a different movement. But it's there. At least they didn't include a date that would have ruined the beautiful symmetry of the dial. Quickly taking off the bracelet and just looking at this case back, I do think Valimor did a really good job on the case back. I was actually pleasantly surprised by how nicely this customized rotor is done. You have this little knurling pattern, this barleycorn almost texture along the outside of the case back that actually looks pretty premium. And this is kind of an aspect that maybe not as many people are going to look at, not as many people are going to care about, quote unquote, but they went the extra mile to actually make this unique and fun and nice looking. And there we go, zooming in on the rotor a little bit. We have this very stylized engraving pattern that not only matches somewhat the dial with this little pattern relief on the back, but you have these engraved dragons into the rotor, which I think is cool. Of course, it's not the most crisp, it's not the most clean, it's not the most premium looking, but at arm's length, not only does it look really good, but the attention to detail, the effort, and just the color tone and everything, the way it pops out from the back of the movement is just a really nice touch. One interesting thing about this brand too is not only do you have the limited edition number inscribed between the lugs there, which I think is a pretty classy way to do it, but Valimor apparently only makes limited edition watches. Like, this is a run of 50, and they have a couple other colorways, but each watch is made of 50 pieces. And I asked the brand, I was like, why do you only create limited editions? And they're like, well, at the end of the day, we want to create a unique product. We want to give the feeling that something is special. And I appreciate that. It is a little bit odd in terms of a business sense because, well, if you're keep creating limited editions, you have to keep coming up with new designs, you have to make things fresh, you have to do it in limited quantities, usually minimum order quantities, possibly make this more expensive because it's so customized. That makes it more of a passion project in my eyes. They're doing this not to make the hugest margins or just get something on the market. They're doing it because they like this design, they want to build on it. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this piece from Solabs, and here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist. And of course it fits fairly well. Of course it is a 40mm, so it doesn't look too big on my wrist. The lug to lug is also relatively short, so it fits well in that aspect. It is a little bit on the thick side, but honestly on the wrist it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like a 15mm watch necessarily, it just feels like a watch, which is nice because it's not something where you feel every millimeter of the thickness and oh my god, this is a terrible watch on wrist. It fits fairly nicely. I will say it's interesting that they went for a 22mm bracelet. It starts with 22 up here, it goes down to 20mm at the clasp, so it is a very slight taper, but it doesn't really feel tapered. It's a very thick bracelet. It's a little bit, I would say, maybe large for this size. I would have been very much okay with a 20mm bracelet, but as it is, once you put it on other straps, it doesn't feel as weird, but interesting aspect. I will say too, especially because the lugs themselves are very thin, almost delicate in a way, having such a large lug space here I think is slightly at odds with that design aspect. It feels like this should be a little bit more elegant here going down from the lugs into the bracelet, but the bracelet is big and blocky and very kind of in your face with the scaled pattern. So although it's fun and it's a unique design point, maybe some people will like it because it feels like a nice sturdy watch bracelet type look. I'm not the hugest fan. Looking at the watch from the side view, again, you can see what I mean when I say it doesn't wear overly thick. It wears its thickness well. The case back really sits into the wrist. The case body, while thicker, doesn't look too crazy. And then, of course, you have some of the rest of the height in the bezel and the crystal. I do wish they could slim it down a little bit more. I do think it would refine the watch and just make it a little bit of a better package. But as it stands, it is still a nice watch. So moving on to some other straps. First I have this nice kind of brownish tan strap from Has No Bounds, really good strap company. I'll have it linked down below. I think this brown tone really works well with the kind of goldenish, brownish tones that are on the dial. They are obviously golden, but from wrist view, they almost look a little bit more brown appearing. And yeah, because this is a 22 that actually has a taper, I think it makes the watch a little bit more elegant. Obviously much different appearance than when we had it on bracelet. I really like this color tone, makes the blue pop, but complements it really well, makes it a little bit more casual, makes it not as aggressive as the bracelet. So really fun strap, really good combo, and again, still wears well even on a leather strap. If you want a little bit more of a fun, unique combo, there's this nice, I don't really know what they call it. I believe this is called the Snow with an E. I'll have it linked down below. From Veblenist strap, they have this kind of like wax layer on the top that wears away and reveals this kind of deeper blue tone. So it is a really cool, almost rustic looking strap that I think pairs really well with the blue tones. One thing to note is because the lugs are a little bit on the short side for the size, the lug holes are fairly close to the case. So if you have a very thick strap, kind of won't fit perfectly, but even this one has a little bit of a thicker end and it's kind of like right up against it. So just something to keep in mind. This looks pretty cool, really plays off the blue tones well, introduces a nice color, but it's not too much and complements it. So yeah, this is a watch that actually surprisingly works well on straps despite even the 22mm lug width. And lastly, my lovely White Archer silicone strap. I think it looks perfect on this watch, complements the white tones amazingly, again, makes the watch just pop, complements the blue, but also just really works well and just makes it feel, makes everything feel a little bit brighter, which I like. And yeah, let's get on wrist. Looks amazing in my opinion, and it's interesting too because although this is a 22mm strap that doesn't taper, it's 22 to 22, I really like this on the watch. I think maybe because it's a little bit slimmer than the bracelet, it really just plants the watch amazingly well. Again, it's going to be a little bit more comfortable because we're talking silicone versus steel. So yeah, I do really like this combo. I think this is something that's kind of a no-brainer for the watch, especially with how pure white that numeral signature leans, because that BGW9, it really pairs amazingly with the strap. So taking a look at the Lume here, as you can see, everything's well lit. It just isn't that bright. It does need to be a little bit better of an application of BGW9. Obviously you have the hands, the indices, and the seconds hand lit well. Even the bezel, but of course it dies fairly quickly. It isn't bright to begin with. So that's something they can improve upon. Reluming and comparing to the Timex, you can see although they start off as fairly similar temperatures, the Timex, at least in person, is of course a little bit brighter, obviously much more legible, and again, the Valimor just starts to die off a little bit too quickly for my taste, so they do need to just step up a little bit. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros for me is just the design is unique. It has a dial that I haven't quite seen before, it has a handset I haven't seen before, it has just kind of a dial layout and font used that isn't really in any other watch. So there's a lot going for it in terms of originality, which I really appreciate. It isn't just a copy and paste Submariner or a copy and paste Royal Oak, or it's not a clone of anything, and that's refreshing. Another big pro for the watch, I think, is the dial itself. Not only are the elements on the dial done well, but the dial texture is done nicely. Of course, it can be a little bit deeper, it can be a little bit more defined, but as it stands, the texture is well done. It is legible that there is a depth to the texture itself, and it has a nice gradient. It's not maybe a perfect, super high-end degradé type effect, but as it stands, it does look really good, and it adds a lot of depth to the dial that otherwise wouldn't have been there. My last pro for the watch is I just do think they did a very good job with color and the accenting of color. They did blue, steel, and gold, and it accents really nicely. It doesn't feel overpowered, and it, in my opinion, just looks really good. It's not a color combination I guess we see too often, especially in the micro brand space, so it's nice that they went for a little bit more of a risk, especially with some of their other colorways, and to me, executed it well. So moving on to cons, and one of my cons at least is just the bracelet itself. One, it doesn't taper, which I would have liked to see a little bit of taper. And two, it has a butterfly clasp, which I'm just not a huge fan of. It wasn't the sharpest, craziest butterfly clasp I've ever felt, but it wasn't amazing. It also only has one size of link to it, so it can't really be narrowed in terms of fit, so that's just something I do think they should improve on. Or if they don't want to go through the trouble of adding different size links, just add a regular fold-over clasp that has micro adjust little holes built in. I think you were able to see in the video that the bracelet wearing on the wrist compared to how a strap wore, it just felt like a thicker watch. It felt more substantial in a way, and that's just not something I like in a watch. If that's something you do enjoy and you want the watch to be a little bit more bold, then you'll probably have a great time with it, but it just wasn't my style. Another con I have for the watch is the lume isn't great. It kind of dies fairly quickly. It's not too heavily applicated, so I just think that if they improved how much lume there was on the dial, it'd be awesome. But I do appreciate that they went with the ABGW9 lume, and it is a pure perfect white, and it matches great between the hands and the numerals, which is seemingly hard to do for a lot of brands. Another slight con is the watch is just a tad thick. It's just about 15 millimeters with the crystal. And it's one of those things where, honestly, at least on a strap, it doesn't wear that badly. It sits pretty well, it integrates nicely, but it is on the thicker side. It doesn't feel slab-sided or crazy, or I've tried on things like, let's say, a Tudor Black Bay Chrono that feels way kind of worse and way less ergonomic than this watch does. But if they can go for a thinner movement or find ways to kind of slim down the case profile or perceived case profile, I think that would just only be beneficial. And lastly, I just think they did something interesting with the lugs. They went with a very slim, almost elegant lug profile, but they gave it a 22 millimeter lug width, which is fairly wide for a 40 millimeter case. Doesn't feel at perfect harmony with the design, in my opinion. Again, you do have some of those larger elements on the dial, like the hands and the numerals, compared to like standard other watches that you typically see. So it kind of almost makes sense that the rest of the case should follow that design language. Sure, the bezel's a little bit thin, but that should probably be a little thicker as well. So it's one of those things where there's small little design tweaks I think can be made that make this design from great to almost perfect. So final thoughts on the watch, and I honestly liked it a lot more than I thought I would. When I saw the original design, I was kind of like, it's okay, maybe I will like it, maybe I won't. There was a lot of detail there that I saw that I thought, if that's done well, it could land nicely in person, but I've never experienced one before, so we just kind of had to find out. And again, there's a lot of good about this watch. I think it's at a price point that's fairly competitive. I just do think there's little small quality of life improvements that they can make to the movement and just the outside aesthetic that could elevate the entire watch and make it even better value. And following on from that, is this the best value for money watch that's out there? No. But you're getting a very unique design. You're getting something that's completely original. I do think there's value in that. There's also value in the fact that they did something completely original and got it relatively right in most areas. I think this is a great release from the brand. I did like some of their previous models, and I like to see the direction they're going in. Unfortunately, it does seem like they do mainly limited edition, so potentially they might come out with this version in different dials, or maybe they might come out with a, Mark II of this watch in some slightly different upgraded way. But until then, we'll see what the brand does. I'm excited to see what comes next, and if you like this watch, there's a couple more variations still available, so check it out. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you in another one.